So several atheists responded to my video, What Atheists Confuse. A link to that video and all their responses are attached below. And now it is my turn to respond. So what are some of the things they say? Well, first, a couple started off by not even attacking the argument in the video, but wanting to clarify some things about philosophy of science. And this is fine. The video is not about philosophy of science, but how philosophy of religion works in reaching the conclusion that God exists. The argument I was making in the video was not to explain the complex field of philosophy of science, but to contrast the commonly understood scientific method with how a philosopher arrives at the conclusion that God exists.
The scientific method consists of asking a question, proposing a possible solution called a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis through a series of experiments, examining the results of the experiments to see if the hypothesis has been supported or refuted, and then proposing a new question or a new hypothesis.
However, a philosopher doesn't argue God exists by taking the same route. All I was doing is pointing out that there are other ways of drawing conclusions other than the scientific method. And yes, I am well aware that nothing in science is ever technically proven. Again, this was hardly the point of the video, which is why I said we conclude it is scientifically proven. Not that it technically is. What we conclude is proven doesn't mean it is or always will be the case. It simply means we accept it as fact unless someone comes along and shows us our errors, and then we adjust properly. So focusing on this aspect was kind of humorous to me, as it missed the main point entirely of what I was trying to say. However, this was not the only point they brought up. Some of them took the next section out of context, where I addressed a total skeptical atheist, one who just looks at the evidence and says, I don't know. The point they brought up is that one can still not have an answer while still being skeptical of the inference of a designer. And I would agree. And note, this really doesn't address what I was saying. If you are skeptical of a designer, it means you have a reason for why there cannot be a designer. You're not arguing from pure ignorance, but giving evidence or reasons to justify your skepticism. Just like with this analogy Sam gave.
Recently, the trash got taken out at my house. Now, I live with 4 other people. My 3 roommates and one of my roommates' girlfriend. So, I think that the girlfriend took it out because she has been, cooking, cleaning a lot more because she has a lot of free time at the moment. And, she likes to be appreciative of the fact that we let her stay there and we really have greeted her as a member of the house. However, I don't have proof of this because I never saw her take out the trash. It's a reasonable inference, but I would never say that I know that. I would say that I believe that that's the case. However, I can rule out that it was Socrates because Socrates has been dead for thousands of years.
Exactly. You can rule out Socrates because you have good evidence or reasons to rule him out. He is dead, and you have good reasons to infer why it was the girlfriend. This is not the same thing as being a total skeptic or pure agnostic, one who simply looks at the evidence and refuses to infer anything or offer counter-evidence to the possibility of a designer. Your analogy actually helped what I was trying to say, in that you gave a good argument for why it was the girlfriend and not Socrates. So when it comes to the evidence pointing to a designer, you can't just say, I don't know, but I know the theist is wrong. You need to provide reasons why the best inference is not a designer. If you want to rule out the possibility of a designer, like you can rule out Socrates, then you need to give reasons, not just be skeptical and assume that is good enough. Sam also responded to my address that extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence. Instead, I took Sagan's popular phrase out of context. He argued that
there's nothing inherent about this statement the way that you want it to be. It's not about something being extraordinary. Instead, it's about the fact that every claim has its own burden of proof.
Which I agree. Claims do require evidence. The question I am returning to you is what gives you the right to say the existence of God is extraordinary? You admit to some degree it is subjective, but then argue that Sagan's phrase is self-evident and should be obvious common sense. However, if you say that, then it should also be obvious that common sense is just as subjective, as many feel belief in God is self-evident. In fact, Dr. Justin Barrett identifies that belief in God seems to be self-evident among children. His book, Born Believers, argues that the science supports the idea that we are born to know God exists, and it is a self-evident belief. Now, obviously, some have argued against his work, but his point is simply that for most people across the globe, the belief in God seems to be self-evident, and not an extraordinary claim by any standard for them. So if you want to say the statement, extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence, is self-evident, then I can simply respond that that's subjective, and the existence of God seems to be self-evident for me and many others. So we obviously do not have the same self-evident beliefs. Either way, Sagan's popular phrase doesn't refute the argument that the existence of a designer is the most logical inference from the evidence we do have. Now you could do as Gary Edwards did and attack my objection to Sagan's phrase by building a straw man.
Cautious atheists may use the term in a more technical sense, meaning in apparent violation of natural law. And it is in this sense in which reports of miracles are extraordinary.
Gary, never once did I argue in my previous video that claims of miracles are evidence. I argue the evidence put forward by natural theology, not miraculous claims, should at least entail that the best inference is that God exists.
At the very least, and to put it with excessive modesty, scientific naturalism is in the running when it comes to offering the best explanation of phenomena like apparent fine-tuning or consciousness. It also does not appear to have dawned upon IP that scientific naturalism may contribute to natural theology rather than assault it. Perhaps he needs to be reminded that to do natural theology is to do little more than to reach conclusions about God based on reason and observation rather than revelation and scripture.
Look, Gary, if you don't agree with me, that's fine, but don't put words in my mouth. At least address what I said and not a straw man. I didn't use scripture as evidence in my other video, and I also never denied that science contributes to natural theology. Remember the inferences I listed? Clearly I acknowledge that science contributes to natural theology. And of course I would agree with your claim that natural explanations are preferred. I never denied this. My point was that things like the hard problem of consciousness and the beginning of the universe do not have adequate natural explanations and infer something beyond the natural. If there was a perfectly reasonable natural explanation, I would not have listed them. I will give you credit though. You acknowledge that God is not impossible, whereas Sam and DeconvertedMan seem to not realize that the concept of God has been properly defined going as far back as St. Augustine. And I gave this definition in my series on the ontological argument and defended it. So this just shows a lack of knowledge on philosophy of religion. Of course, this was not my favorite part of DeconvertedMan's response. I thoroughly enjoyed his misuse of logical fallacies. His entire video was supposed to point out the large amount of fallacies in mine. Unfortunately, he only demonstrated that he doesn't understand when someone is committing a logical fallacy. For example, when I quoted someone or referred to them, he called it an appeal to authority. And if that was the case, then I guess everyone in the history of writing who has ever quoted anyone has committed this logical fallacy. But that is not what an appeal to authority is, and he should know this. An appeal to authority, as defined by Philosophy 103, Introduction to Logic, is the fallacy of appealing to the testimony of an authority outside his special field. Quoting Thomas Nagel, who is a philosopher, is not an appeal to authority, and cherry-picking, or quote mining in this case, would only be true if I took the quote out of context. And since you failed to show where I actually did this, this is not a logical fallacy. Also, I didn't appeal to authority with John Lennox or C.S. Lewis either. I simply used their analogies and wanted to give them credit. I did not say, I am right because John Lennox agrees with me, so this is not an appeal to authority.
Equivocation. The word evidence can be used multiple ways and quite often is used multiple ways by apologetics.
He is also wrong here. An equivocation fallacy would be if I used the same word twice to mean different things. And since I only use evidence as a body of facts or information indicating a belief is true, I did not commit the fallacy, and he failed to show where I committed this. Just asserting a logical fallacy doesn't prove I actually committed one, and this is not special pleading. Special pleading would be if I said evidence can be used for God's existence, but evidence cannot be used to show God doesn't exist. And I didn't say atheists cannot use evidence. I said atheists cannot appeal to evidence that doesn't exist in the present as if it was evidence that existed in the present. That in itself would be special pleading.
Ah, so I see. So if the claim is made in the field of philosophy, then the methodology used has to be that of philosophy, even though philosophy doesn't have any methodology.
Philosophy doesn't have any methodology?
You're killing me, Smalls!
Have you ever read anything on philosophical methodology? Ever? Now I could just keep going through this video and responding to every supposed logical fallacy he brought up, but it's getting painful at this point. Before he thinks he can assume everything is a logical fallacy, perhaps he should study what they are and when they are supposed to be used. But perhaps he might just say I'm committing one now. Who knows? On the other hand, you could just hold to an incoherent definition of existence and use that to say that God doesn't exist.
If we say outside the natural world, then the word existence no longer applies.
And as Craig and Moreland pointed out, to define existence this way is to say the natural world doesn't exist. Space and time are not themselves located in space and time, therefore space and time must not exist. When actually existence is better understood as explaining what actually exists, and what could possibly exist. Existence must also itself exist and not violate the laws of logic, and finally must allow for acts of knowing. Now, properly defining existence is still a problem in philosophy, but restricting it to within space-time is nonsense. We need a broader understanding. The overall problem with this response is that it pretended like religious language has not been defended. However, religious language has been proceeding in the past several decades as a fully functioning field of philosophy, and several philosophers have been defending it. It is beyond the scope of this video to dive into that now, but I highly recommend The Coherence of Theism by Richard Swinburne as a good starting point. The argument that it has not been defended is simply absurd. Now, the only response video I received that I was actually pleased by was the one from Dhorpatan. Instead of attacking the video, he directed his video to what was really important: if God is the best inference from the evidence. He actually offered other possible ways to explain them, which is where the conversation should be going, not if future scientists will debunk the existence of God. It is beyond the scope of this video to fully defend the pieces of evidence that point to the existence of a designer, and I plan to do so more formally in other videos. But to quickly respond, I will note that we shouldn't be interested in any old inference, but the best and most reasonable inference. So for all we know, the universe could be eternal, but this is nothing more than a speculation and severely lacks empirical evidence. An eternal universe model still has to get around the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem. As Vilenkin said in 2006, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Eternal inflation models are highly speculative. Cosmologist Laura Massini-Houghton has pointed out that since eternal inflation would have to have a beginning, it implies it must have had very special initial conditions in order that the bubbles are not destroyed. Of course, if it exists, which may not even be the case. 2013 Planck data didn't show any evidence of eternal inflation, so this can hardly be the best inference for fine-tuning. The existence of moral realism is ontologically best grounded in the nature of a necessary eternal being, to affirm its eternal objectivity. The fact that the universe acts like a quantum computer infers it is contingent on information processing, showing the universe must be contingent on something outside of it. The hard problem of consciousness is not addressed by evolution, as it fails to explain how things like qualia can form from purely physical processes. Physical processes have only been observed to produce more of the physical, not different substances altogether. Thus, consciousness infers the existence of mental, non-physical substances. Again, I will defend these inferences more deeply in other videos, but as of now I feared I've gone on too long. Every single point brought up in these response videos cannot be entirely addressed, but I felt it was important to address the main points they brought up and offer a theistic rebuttal.